Spider-Man Far From Home, out in cinemas now, 23rd film in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, second film with Tom Holland's Spider-Man as the lead main character. And I do want to start with the character of Spider-Man and its film history, and it's been a long and interesting one. So Spider-Man has for decades been one of the most popular characters in the comic books, not just Marvel, but comic books overall, which means it may be surprising to some casual viewers to learn that Marvel Studios doesn't actually own movie rights to the character. Those rights sit at Sony Entertainment. And to find out why, we have to go all the way back to the 1990s. Marvel was struggling to stay afloat as a company due to poor comic book sales. And in order to get some cash on hand and save the company, they sold movie rights to some of their most beloved characters, Fantastic Four, X-Men, Hulk, and Spider-Man. They all ended up at different movie studios, but the guy we're interested in landed at Sony. They didn't wait long to produce not just one, but a series of movies. So Spider-Man in 2002, Spider-Man 2 in 2004, and Spider-Man 3 in 2007, all made by Sam Raimi, all starring Tobey Maguire as the main character. Now, the first two were genuinely great movies. They were one of the first modern superhero blockbusters, and because of their success, they sort of paved the way for the future that we now live in. I'm pretty sure without those films, the MCU, if it even existed, would now be widely different. Problems began at Spider-Man 3. In the first two, the director, Sam Raimi, had a decent amount of creative freedom, which probably resulted in them being that good. But by the time production started on the third one, the studio executives got greedy and impatient and started really meddling with the film. They insisted on many changes and elements that ended up making the movie much, much worse than its predecessors. In fact, they even managed to piss off Sam Raimi himself, who, despite planning to make 4 movies originally, left after number 3. That led Sony to look for other options, and they began to float the idea of rebooting the series. Now, around that time, Marvel Studios began to make movies of their own as part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and approached Sony about the possibility of maybe buying back the rights for Spider-Man. Sony, however, decided that they are better off on their own, and they would rather make buckets of money for themselves, since it seemed like superhero movies were just beginning their ascent to the status of the most popular genre that they are now. They didn't account for one thing, though. Marvel Studios was, and still is, run by Kevin Feige, a producer who has been involved in superhero films for many, many years before that. But most importantly, started out not as a Hollywood exec, but as a small-time producer who happened to be a massive comic book fan. That meant that he had a deep understanding of the source material and respect for the characters, the storylines, knew what would work, as evidenced by the current success of the MCU. He's been at the helm of the universe, and despite each individual director having a fair amount of creative freedom on each of those films, he oversees the whole thing and makes sure that the quality of individual movies, as well as the series as a whole, stays at a good enough level. Now, Sony never did have a Kevin Feige. They seemingly had a bunch of donkeys for producers instead, because they decided to go ahead with the reboot. We got a new series, Amazing Spider-Man, with 2 movies released in 2012 and 2014, starring Andrew Garfield this time around. The first one was actually surprisingly decent, even though flawed in some aspects, like making Peter Parker too much of a popular, cool kid, which really goes against his entire character in the comics. But the second one was just garbage, an incoherent mess with too many underdeveloped storylines thrown into one movie. Once again, studio meddling has ruined what could potentially be a longer-running series, and the sequel was met with a lot of criticism. That in itself may not have been enough to correct the course, but there was one more important thing that happened in 2014, and that was the infamous Sony hack. So a group of hackers leaked a lot, and I mean a lot, of confidential information stolen from Sony, most notably including credit card numbers of thousands of PlayStation customers. But another thing that's particularly interesting to us in the context of this story that was leaked was a bunch of internal emails, including ones regarding the Amazing Spider-Man series. In those emails, it was evident that the execs had no fucking clue whatsoever about how to make a good movie, and just tried to modernize Spider-Man without any thought as to how to do it, just to appeal to millennials as they understood them. What was also revealed was that the feedback that Kevin Feige himself gave to Amy Pascal, who was one of the top producers at Sony, after seeing an early cut of Amazing Spider-Man 2. Basically, in this criticism, in this feedback, he nailed all of the criticism that came later. He was able to correctly identify every single thing that would not work about the movie and was wrong about it, and explain why that was the case. His notes were sadly ignored, and as it turns out, after the movie premiered, he was 100% correct. His feedback before the movie came out almost reads word for word like a review. You can find those emails on the internet, by the way, to this day. And if you're interested in the story, I would recommend reading through them because they're quite entertaining. Now, the fandom raised a massive outcry at this. There was a lot of rightful anger about Sony having their heads up their asses and constantly ignoring Marvel. This thing was so big that Sony actually went back to the negotiating table. What came off it was not actually a complete rebuy of the Spider-Man rights, but the next best thing. So Sony has agreed to let Marvel Studios reboot the character again, and this time included in the MCU alongside Captain America and Iron Man and all the rest of the bunch. The deal stated that Sony would finance the solo movies and get 100% profit from them, but they would be produced entirely by Marvel Studios under the eye of Feige. Marvel would also be able to use Spider-Man in team-up movies of their own. The result was the casting of Tom Holland, and so far 5 movies he appeared in. Captain America Civil War, Spider-Man Homecoming, Avengers Infinity War, and Endgame. And finally, Far From Home, which is his 5th outing overall. And the second one as the main character of a film. And so far, Holland has been hailed as pretty much the best Peter Parker Spider-Man combination yet, and widely praised for his performance as well as the quality of the films overall. Now, on to the movie at hand. Coming off the tail end of Avengers Endgame, there were many speculations as to what role the movie was going to fill in the grander scheme of things, with many people speculating that it will be the first chapter in a new multi-film saga or phase, or whatever you want to call it. Feige has come out a couple of months ago and confirmed that actually Far From Home would be treated as the last film in the current Infinity Saga, sort of calmer epilogue after the climax of Endgame. So the question for me was how good the movie was going to be in this regard, but also more importantly, how good it would be as a standalone film. And I have to say that I'm very pleased with the result, which is basically 2 hours of delightful, terrific fun. So the movie opens several months after the events of Endgame. Peter Parker was brought back to life along with his friends after 5 years of basically being erased from existence by the snap. All of those people and many, many others are now dealing with the consequences of those events. The moment we catch up with Peter is when he's going on a science trip to Europe along with his friends, and he's planning to use this opportunity to take a break from crime fighting and instead try to get closer to MJ, played by Zendaya, who he has a huge crush on, and maybe confess his feelings towards her. However, as it often happens for Spider-Man, his secret identity again messes with his life, as this time around Nick Fury is trying to recruit Spider-Man to help fend off the invasion of so-called elementals, being of fire, earth, water and air, that are threatening to end the world as we know it. We know all of this from a new acquaintance of Fury, a man introducing himself as Quentin Beck, quickly named Mysterio, played by Jake Gyllenhaal. Beck claims to be a soldier from an alternate Earth that has already fallen to the elementals, and he is now using his weird quasi-technological, quasi-magical powers to save our Earth. Peter reluctantly agrees to help, feeling the responsibility to step up and fill the shoes of his late mentor Tony Stark. And on the one hand, he tags along with Fury and Mysterio, who quickly befriends him and even sort of begins to feel that same mentor role as previously Stark. On the other, he desperately tries to keep his personal life intact and chase after MJ. And the story goes on from there, and I don't want to say anything more about it to avoid spoilers. So, as I have said already, I absolutely loved the film. I think it's probably even better than Homecoming, which was already really good. And here's a couple of specific reasons why I think that is the case. So the central conflict is solved really, really well, or rather the conflicts, because we have the internal struggle of Peter, whether or not he feels good enough to take on the mantle after Iron Man, and of course between Peter's personal and superhero lives, and the external conflict between him and the villain of the film. I think that especially the internal one is quite important, because first off, this is the engine of the film. This is what really moves the character arc forwards. It's also been a part of Spider-Man for years, for as long as one can remember. This is what made him different always from other superheroes. When he removes the mask, he's not a soldier or god or a genius inventor. He's a high school kid. And Far From Home manages to really make that element shine, and does it without being repetitive. In fact, the movie is really creative when with both its plot points and the action sequences. I think those are far superior to the previous film, and some of them are probably the most interesting visually in the entire MCU. It's just a blast to see them on the big screen. This then ties into another fundamental thing for me, which is that the huge set pieces are not just spectacle for the sake of spectacle, but they are very much grounded and tied into the personal stories and motivations of the characters. Even in the midst of battle, there is always this feeling that this stuff is really very personal and therefore more engaging on the emotional level. The reason that part works so well is, I think, the acting, especially the two leads of the film, Tom Holland and Jake Gyllenhaal. Holland once again shows enormous range from completely comedic scenes to really serious and emotional stuff. And Gyllenhaal clearly has a lot of fun with his role. On the one hand, his early relationship with Peter works really well, also due to the chemistry between the actors. On the other hand, Gyllenhaal is also terrific at showing another side of Mysterio, which is both more sinister and full of flair and charisma and this showmanship. I mean, really great stuff from both of them. Also, Samuel Jackson gives probably the most nuanced performance as Nick Fury so far, although you may not appreciate it until the very end, and I won't say anymore because that would be a spoiler. Finally, the film feels very consistent in terms of tone, which is maybe surprising despite because it mixes a lot of different elements. So there's a lot of comedy, there's a lot of light teen coming of age story, and that all is contrasted with more serious themes of responsibility and confidence and believing in yourself. And on top of that, of course, we have the fantastic action. The movie never feels jarring in any way or cramped with all of this. The story moves along at a nice pace, and the shifts in tone between the scenes are done pretty seamlessly. I guess this is just great job of the editors and the director. If I had to have one criticism of the film, it would be a single subplot with Brad, who is this kid who is sort of romantic rival for Peter and also tries to get MJ. I felt that maybe that was a little bit too underdeveloped and ultimately didn't really amount to much. But really, it's just minor, insignificant gripe. Because overall, Far From Home easily maintains the very top level of character-driven entertainment that Marvel Studios has us used to. It's fantastic in every aspect, and I hope to see this iteration of Spider-Man for years to come, because there are more exciting stories to tell, and I'm very hungry for them.